Hi and welcome to another story, and today we have part 3 of Bad Girls by Jacqueline Wilson, continuing from page 58, Green. I had to go to school on Monday. Mum took me. She wore her best navy suit, though it's really too small for her now. It's got tiny lines called pinstripes. Mum had pinstripes across her forehead too. She only frowns like that when she's very cross. "Oh, Mum, please, promise you won't say anything," I begged. I nearly died when we turned the corner and caught up Melanie and her mother. Melanie went bright red when she saw me. She looked as if she was going to cry. Melanie's mum started talking to my mum about the weather and the holidays and grown-up stuff like that. Melanie and I shuffled along, trying not to look at each other, and then I heard Melanie give a little sniff. "I thought you might be dead," she said. I blinked at her. "When you didn't come to school the next day, and Arthur said you were taken off in an ambulance, but you're all right now." "It's just my wrist." I held my arm out, though there was nothing to show. I didn't need the sling anymore. "Oh, Mandy," Melanie blew upwards with relief, ruffling her fluffy fringe. "Even Kim was in a right state, I can tell you." I giggled nervously. "Mandy," Melanie struggled. "Well, I'm glad you're all right." I nodded, knowing there were lots of things she wanted to say but couldn't. I felt as if a huge breath was ruffling me all over, making me light and bouncy. I was all right. Melanie was glad I was all right. It looked as if everything was going to be all right again now. But as we got nearer school, Melanie stepped aside from me and went quiet. I realised it was in case Kim saw us. And then at the school gate, Mum suddenly stopped speaking to Melanie's mum and looked hard at Melanie. "It's a shame you're not Mandy's friend anymore," said Mum. Melanie went red again. Melanie's mum looked embarrassed too. "Yes, I don't know why they've had their little tiff. Still, girls will be girls," she said uneasily. "It's more than a little tiff," said Mum. "I don't really blame your Melanie. It's that other girl, Kim." "Yes, I don't know why Melanie got so pally with her. I don't see why they can't all be friends anyway, but I expect they'll sort it out between themselves," said Melanie's mum. "I'm going to make sure things are sorted out," said Mum. She marched through the school gate and into the playground. I dashed after her. Mum, what are you doing? Where are you going?" "I'm going to have a little word with Mrs. Edwards," said Mum. I felt faint. The head mistress. "Mum, you can't tell Mrs. Edwards," I said, my voice squeaking with shock. "They'll hate me and think I'm a sneaky telltale." "Don't be silly, darling," said Mum, "and you needn't get at all involved. You can go off to your classroom and forget all about it. I just need to let Mrs. Edwards know what's happened in her school." "But you don't understand. You can't," I wailed. She could. I had no way of stopping her. I trailed into Mrs. Stanley's classroom. Kim was there, standing at the front. She seemed to grow. I seemed to shrink. Melanie was yakking away to her, pointing at me. Sarah was there too, chewing her lip as she listened. I heard the word Mandy. I heard the word Mum. "Right," said Kim, and she put her hands on her hips and turned to me. But Mrs. Stanley came bustling in with a basket of roses and started cheerily chatting about her weekend in the country. She sent me off to fill some vases with water for the flowers. I wished there was some way I could stay in the cloakroom all day long, filling vase after vase for a whole field of flowers. But I had to go back and arrange the roses and answer the register, and then get out my things for maths, when all the time I was peering out the window to see if Mum had finished seeing Mrs. Edwards. It was halfway through the lesson when I spotted Mum going across the playground, looking hot and uncomfortable in her tight suit. Her skirt rode up and showed her fat knees. The tightness of her skirt made her walk with a waggle. I saw Kim wiggling her shoulders, imitating Mum. Someone giggled. I bent over my maths book and pretended to be working, though all the numbers squirmed across the page and my hands were so wet that I smudged the sums I'd already done. I hoped that it was all over now, but it wasn't all over. It was just beginning. One of Mrs. Edwards' monitors suddenly came into the classroom. "Excuse me, Mrs. Stanley, but Mrs. Edwards wants to see Kim Matthews, Melanie Holder and Sarah Newman in her office straight away." The monitor announced this importantly, so that everyone heard. All heads shriveled and swiveled towards Kim and Melanie and Sarah. Sarah started chewing her lip so violently that her mouth went sideways. Melanie looked like ice cream, white and wet, but Kim looked perfectly composed, though her cheeks were a little pinker than usual and her eyes brighter as she looked at me. I knew what her look meant. She was really going to get me now. I bent right over my maths book, clenching everything. I stayed like that long after they'd left the classroom. I suddenly felt a hand on my shoulder and jumped. "What's the matter, Mandy?" said Mrs. Stanley. I shook my head, trying to pretend. "Why are you sitting like that, dear? Have you got a tummy ache?" I nodded. Mrs. Stanley bent closer. "Do you need to go to the toilet?" I nodded again. "Well, why didn't you say so, you silly girl?" said Mrs. Stanley. "Really, you're not a baby, Mandy. Off you go, then." I shot off and sat in the dank toilets, crying, wishing I was a baby, a little helpless baby who didn't ever have to go to school. One of Mrs. Williams' babies in a pram, and then Tanya could still come and play with me. I sat in the toilets for ages. I read all the rude rhymes, much, much ruder than anything Arthur had ever written on his plaster cast. Then someone came to the toilets, calling my name. Mandy White, are you in here? I hunched up small behind the door, hoping they'd go away. There was a hammering on the door. Are you in there, Mandy? Because Mrs. Stanley says if you're really not well, you'd better go to the office. And you've got to go to the office anyway because Mrs. Edwards wants you. It was no use. I couldn't stay silent behind the door forever. She'd jump up and look over the top in a minute. Just coming, I mumbled, and flushed the toilet. I came out and washed my hands. The monitor looked at me curiously. What were you doing in there? I shook my head, not answering. Were you sick? No, though I was starting to feel sick. I looked at myself in the spotted mirror. I was a weird pale greeny colour, a lighter shade of the bottle green cardigan that Mum had knitted for me, even though everyone else had proper shop-bought jumpers. Come on, then. I followed her out of the toilets, and along the corridors. I smelt the school dinners cooking in the canteen and felt sicker than ever. Kim and Sarah and Melanie were waiting outside Mrs. Edwards' office. I wondered if I was going to throw up all over my carefully fitted Clark's sandals. Sarah and Melanie looked as if they felt sick too. Melanie was actually crying, but not Kim. I didn't dare look at her properly as I scuttled past. I knocked on Mrs. Edwards' door and stumbled in. I'd never ever been in her office before. You only got summoned if you'd been very naughty or cheeky or disruptive. Ah, where have you been, Mandy? We practically had to send out a search party, said Mrs. Edwards. I hadn't often talked to her in all my years at the school. I'd shaken her hand at prize day, and once when I'd done the reading at assembly, she'd smiled at me and said, "Well done." I didn't like to say the word toilet to her. I just stood there, not finishing my sentence. Sit down then, Mandy. Now, I hear you've been having a rather unhappy time at school recently. I sat down and stared hard at my lap. I didn't know what to say to this either. You've certainly done very well at your lessons, and you've seemed happy and cheerful enough as far as we could see, said Mrs. Edwards briskly. Oh, yes, I said, desperate to agree, but for a while now there have been some girls who have been upsetting you. I bent lower. Some girls in your class? Mrs. Edwards persisted. My head was nearly touched by clasped hands. Mandy, sit up straight. Now, there's no need to look so worried. We're going to get this little problem all sorted out. If you'd only told your teacher about it earlier, then it would have been so much easier to nip this nasty bullying in the bud. So why don't you tell me all about it? She waited. I waited too. Mrs. Edwards took her glasses off and rubbed the purple pinch marks on the bridge of her nose. She was trying to be patient. Now look, Mandy, there's no need to be frightened. You can tell me. I know it all already, but I just want to hear it from your lips. She paused. She sighed. She put her glasses back on and peered at me. It's Kim and Sarah and Melanie, isn't it? She said. So what have they been saying to you, I couldn't speak. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I couldn't gather together all those worrying weeks of teasing and squeeze them out into short sentences, especially not with Kim and Sarah and Melanie waiting just the other side of the door. Your mother says they've been tormenting you. Is that right? Mrs. Edwards persisted. And last Wednesday they chased you right out into the road and you were knocked down by a bus. Is that true, Mandy? Because this is very, very serious and it has to be dealt with. Did they chase you, Mandy? Did they? Well, sort of, I mumbled into my lap. Aha, said Mrs. Edwards. So, what were they saying to you? I can't remember, I said, shaking my head to stop the words echoing in my ears. Well, what sort of things do they usually say? Mrs. Edwards demanded. I forget, I said. Mrs. Edwards sighed. She stood up. She suddenly went over to the door, swiftly in her stubby heels, and opened it up. Kim shot backwards, taken by surprise. So you've been listening, Kim, said Mrs. Edwards. Why don't you three girls come in here and join us? Perhaps we'll only start to get somewhere if we all talk about this through together. They came crowding into the office. I shrank down into my chair. Mrs. Edwards shut the door and sat on the edge of her desk, frowning at Kim. Kim was taller than her. She had her head stuck in the air, one hand on her hip, acting like she couldn't care less. Melanie and Sarah were shuffling and drooping, much more scared. As doubtless you heard for yourself, Mandy, Mandy here is being incredibly loyal to you girls, refusing to say anything against you, said Mrs. Edwards. They all looked at me. Melanie blinked at me gratefully. Sarah sniffed. But it's obvious to me that you three girls have been very unkind to Mandy, and this has got to stop. Do you hear? I detest bullying. I won't have it in my school. Now, Kim, Melanie, Sarah, I want you three to say you're sorry to Mandy and promise that you won't call her any nasty names or chase her ever again. They swallowed. Melanie started to say sorry, but Kim interrupted. I think Mandy should say sorry to us, she said, tossing her head. Even Mrs. Edwards was taken aback. It was just as much Mandy's fault, Kim went on smoothly. That's what started it. She told us these stories about her mum being a fashion model. Mrs. Edwards' lips twitched. She was obviously thinking about Mum in her too tight suit. Don't be ridiculous, Kim, she said crisply. Don't make things worse for yourself, telling these silly lies. I'm not lying, Mrs. Edwards, said Kim. You did say that, didn't you, Mandy? I bent my head further. I knew I was going very red. Mandy, said Mrs. Edwards, her voice wavering. It was Mandy who told the lies, Mrs. Edwards, said Sarah. And then, when we told her we knew she was lying, she got really furious, and she shouted at us. And then she hit me, said Kim. Now really, Kim, you can't expect me to believe that, said Mrs. Edwards. Mandy's half your size. But she still hit me, really hard. She did, Mrs. Edwards. She punched Kim straight in the face, said Sarah. Yes, she did, Melanie said, joining in. She hit Kim. And then she ran away, and she wasn't looking where she was going, so she got hit by the bus, said Kim. It was all Mandy, Mrs. Edwards. Mrs. Edwards got up and came and stood beside me. She put her arm around the back of the chair and bent her head towards me so that her pepperminty breath tickled my cheek. You didn't hit Kim, did you, Mandy? She said softly. I shut my eyes. Just tell the truth, dear, said Mrs. Edwards. Yes, I hit her, I said, and then I burst into tears. Kim was triumphant. Mrs. Edwards looked at me as if I'd let her down. I still can't quite believe it of you, Mandy, she said. But then she frowned at Kim and the others. However, I know that you three have certainly been ganging up on Mandy recently. It's got to stop. You're not to call her names or say anything horrid to her. Do you understand? Oh, yes, Mrs. Edwards, we understand, said Kim. We won't say anything to Mandy. That was the catch. She kept to her word. She didn't say anything at all to me. Neither did Sarah, neither did Melanie. Kim marched them off at lunch, and by lunchtime they had their act perfected. They hovered near me, but they didn't speak. They looked at me. They nudged each other. They made faces, but they didn't say anything. I tried to pretend I was Miranda Rainbow, far too cool to care. It wouldn't work, though, not with them bobbing about in the background. Arthur King came over to me, his eyes twitching behind his glasses. He was holding a big old book, and he offered it to me like a talisman. Here's that book I was telling you about, Mandy, he said, gabbling a little. Do you want to have a look at it? Kim screeched with unkind laughter. Sarah and Melanie giggled. Over here, where we can have a bit of peace, said Arthur, steering me away from them. The book was King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. I flipped through it, gratefully, my hands shaking as I turned the pages. Kim and Sarah and Melanie followed. Look, clear off, said Arthur, trying to sound threatening. We've got a perfect right to be in this playground, same as you, said Kim. We're not doing anything, and we're not saying anything to her. She thrust her chin at me, smacking her lips together to show they were sealed. Sarah and Melanie copied. Mrs. Stanley was on playground duty. She walked in our direction. She saw Kim and Sarah and Melanie, but I suppose they looked as if they were smiling at me. Let's get away from these loonies, Arthur muttered, and he pulled me right over to the edge of the playground, by the boys' toilets, where the girls never go. We leaned against the wall and looked at Arthur's book together. Kim and Sarah and Melanie kept away, maybe because Mrs. Stanley kept walking backwards and forwards across the playground, keeping an eye on things. Arthur kept finding me his favourite bits and reading paragraphs to me. It wasn't really my sort of thing at all. The king and the knights all spoke in this weird old-fashioned way, and I kept getting them all mixed up. But it didn't really matter. I did like the pictures, especially the women with their flowing hair and long swirly dresses. They looked a little like the picture Tanya had drawn of her mother. My mother came to collect me from school. She wanted to know what Mrs. Edwards had said to me, what she had done, how she had dealt with Kim and Melanie and Sarah. Shh, Mum, I said, agonised because we were still at the school gates and anyone could hear us. Kim and Melanie and Sarah weren't that far behind. They all had their mouths pressed together, their big new joke. Did Mrs. Edwards give that Kim a good telling off, said Mum. Please, Mum, don't let's talk about it now, I hissed. Mum looked back over her shoulder. That's her, isn't it? The tall girl with a black fringe. Well, she doesn't look very sorry. She's got a smirk all over her face, said Mum. Maybe I'd better have a few words with that young madam. Mum, no, please, 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 I begged. Mrs. Edwards sorted it all out, and they've promised they won't say anything else. Are you sure, Mandy, said Mum. You still look very bothered, darling. I'm not bothered a bit, I said, trying to smile and act bouncy. And then I saw Tanya at the end of the road, pushing the baby. Tanya in her shortish shorts and a tiny top showing off her navel, her high heels clacking at each step. Tanya! Hey, Mandy! I went charging up the road to greet her. She did that high-five hand thing, so I did it too. How was school then, eh? She said. I pulled her face. I get you, said Tanya. It's great for me, eh? I don't have to go because it's nearly the summer holidays. But that, not that I ever go much. I can't stick school, and them stupid teachers, and silly cows calling you names. They call you names, I said, astonished. Yeah, but I call them worse stuff, said Tanya, grinning. Why anyone giving you hassle, Mandy? Ooh, I said vaguely. Kim and Sarah Melanie were already past Mum, who was puffing in the background. They were staring at Tanya and me. Melanie practically had her mouth hanging open. Tanya saw me glance at them. She had it all sussed out in a second. She ignored Sarah and Melanie. They were small fry beneath her. She looked straight at Kim. What are you staring at then? She said. She wasn't as tall as Kim, even in her high heels, but she was older and much, much tougher. Nothing, Kim mumbled. Good. We'll run off home, little girlies. Leave me and my pal Mandy in peace, eh? They cleared off, even Kim. Their faces. Me and my pal Mandy. I was Tanya's friend. I was sure they were green with envy. I'm taking his lordship for a walk around the park, said Tanya. Coming? I was desperate to go, but when Mum reached us, she wouldn't hear of us going there by ourselves. No, you can get funny men hanging around there, said Mum. It's no place for young girls on their own. I'll look after you, Mandy, don't worry, said Tanya. Thank you, dear, but I really don't think so. Mandy had better come home with me and have her tea, said Mum. Oh, Mum, please. I've got to go to the park, I begged. We can have ice creams if she's peckish, said Tanya, jiggling coins in her tiny pocket. Mrs. Williams gave me some spending money. Oh, please, Mrs. White, go on, say yes. No, dear, perhaps another day, said Mum, taking hold of my hand. I pulled it away. I want to go, Mum. It's not fair. Why do you have to treat me like a baby all the time? I said. Mum blinked at me, looking hurt, but she seemed to be wavering. I was suddenly inspired. Mrs. Edwards said I should try to be a bit more independent, I said. She thinks I'm too young for my age, and that's why the others pick on me. Don't be silly, Mandy, said Mum, but she sounded uncertain. Maybe Mrs. Edwards really had said something of the sort. We'll be back in half an hour, said Tanya. Mum sighed. All right, if you really want to go to the park, Mandy, we'll walk along with Tanya. I took a deep breath. No, you don't have to come, Mum. There's not even any main roads or anything, and we'll keep away from any funny men. All the others go up the park by themselves, not with their mums. I couldn't believe it was me saying it. Miranda Rainbow had taken over my mouth, and it worked. Mum let me go to the park with Tanya, though she didn't look at all happy about it. I knew she'd be hurt and huffy all evening, but for once I didn't care. Tanya and I ran across the grass, like Ricky jiggling up and down in the pram. Tanya sang old Nirvana songs, and I tried to copy her. Ricky burbled a bit too, but then the bumping got a bit much for him. Yuck, baby Ricky's been a bit sicky, said Tanya. She mopped him up with a tissue, wrinkling her nose, and then washed her hands in the paddling pool. My dad used to take me here when I was little, I said. Sometimes he used to roll up his trouser legs and come in with me. Your dad sounds nice, said Tanya. But my mum's a bit... I pulled her face. I was scared Tanya might tease me about Mum. She fusses because she cares about you, said Tanya, surprisingly. I used to fuss about Carmel heaps. Do you miss her a lot? Yeah, said Tanya, folding her arms and hunching over, but then she straightened up again. Still, I've got you instead now, haven't I? Young Mandy. I'm not young Mandy, I protested. Tanya laughed and pulled my plait. You look about 6 with these. Don't, it's not my fault. I begged my mum to let me have it up the way you did it, but she wouldn't do it. You should learn to fix it yourself, said Tanya. We walked up and down slowly, rocking Ricky until he nodded off to sleep. Tanya parked him carefully in the shade. But we can do a spot of sunbathing, eh, Mandy? She kicked off her sandals and lay back on the grass, pulling up her top even more. I've got to get my tummy brown, she said. I don't go brown, I just go pink, I said, lying down beside her. I hate pink, it's my least favourite colour in all the world. Well, we'll just lie in the sun for 2 minutes. We don't want you burning, said Tanya. I didn't care if I frizzled into a crisp. I wanted to stay lying next to Tanya in the sun forever. I stared up at the green leaves far above us. They rustled, as if they were sharing a secret. Oh, Tanya, I'm so happy I've got you for my friend, I said. Ah, you're sweet, said Tanya. She sat up. Hey, you're going pink already. We'd better cool you down. Let's go and buy ice creams. We went to the kiosk at the park gates. Tanya bought us a small 99 cone each. Ricky wailed enviously, so Tanya put a little swirl of ice cream on her finger, and so he could lick it off. He liked this game and moaned for more. No, greedy guts, you make yourself sick again, said Tanya. Come on, Mandy, we'd better get you home. Can't have your mum fussing. We walked along companionably, both of us pushing the pram. Tanya's heels went clack and my Clark's shoes squeaked. Her shadow was bouncy, with fancy hair. Mine was smaller and plodding and plaited. Hey, mind Ricky for me while I get Pat her paper, said Tanya, when she got to the corner shop. I stood outside, gently rocking Ricky, feeling great to be left in charge of a baby. I peered into the shop to watch Tanya. It was shadowy after the sunlight. I could just make her out, fiddling in her shorts pocket to get the right change for the Evening Standard. She handed it over, she took the paper, and she walked towards the door. Then her hand reached out. Quick as a wink, she snatched something off a shelf and carried on sauntering straight out of the shop. "Hey, Mandy, got your little present," said Tanya, holding out her hand. It was a green velvet, crinkled hairband. And that is where we will leave part 3 of Bad Girls by Jacqueline Wilson. I'll be back soon with the next part of this fantastic story, and lots more stories and videos coming your way very soon. If you'd like to subscribe or hit a like, that's always appreciated. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.